Thanks for joining us for The Dark Nest 2. I'm Sophie, the director of The Spring, and I'm delighted to introduce this event. Back in January, Professor Sue Harper presented a reading of some of her short stories at The Spring. It was a lively sell-out event, and we were really pleased when she agreed to do a follow-up in May. Sadly, since then, of course, The Spring has had to close as a result of the coronavirus. Where we can, we're taking work online, and I'm really delighted that Sue has decided to help us with this. So here is Sue reading some of her short stories. They are a little unusual, but we hope they entertain. Each story is accompanied by a photo provided by David Parr, and the last one is a short film made by Alan Everett with Sue's voiceover. Sue's new book, The Dark Nest, containing many new stories, has been published by Aegeus Press, and you can also read more on her website at sueharper.co.uk. These are difficult times for The Spring, so if you enjoy this event, please consider making a donation online at thespring.co.uk. It will really help us while we're closed and make sure we can come back stronger than ever when it's safe to do so. Thanks for watching, and I really hope you enjoy this event.
Sarah put her hand down the back of the sofa to look for her mobile phone and was shocked when her fingers were grasped by a tiny ice-cold hand. She shrieked, but it would not let go. With great difficulty, she drew her hand out and examined the tiny creature clinging onto it. It was a perfectly proportioned little woman, 6 inches high. It sat down in the palm of her hand and piped, "Thank goodness! I've been waiting ages for you to find and acknowledge me. I am one of the people you might have been. My name is Suspiria." Sarah looked askance. "What do you mean? As far as I'm aware, my choices were rationally made. I don't think that I have any repressed desires." Suspiria replied, "There are hinges in everyone's life. Events after which nothing is ever the same again. Often you don't know how momentous they are. There have been several in your life. I come from that evening in Piraeus when you waved your lover goodbye from the quayside. If you had gone with him, you would have been me. But there are other moments too. Put your hand down the side of the sofa." Again. Frightened, Sarah did so and pulled out one little twirling mannequin after another. "If you had failed that examination on that hot afternoon, you would have been me. If you had answered back to your boss that April, you would have been me. If you had learnt Spanish instead of German, you would have been me. If you had not decided to be so tough, you would have been me." On and on they went, clambering out of the upholstery. There were so many of them. They danced over her body, and there wasn't a lot she could do about it without injuring them. They were, after all, her unasked questions, her unmade journeys, the songs she had not sung. She said, "What will it take to make you go down back into the sofa again?" With one accord, they cried, "We will go back if you come with us." "Very well," Sarah said. Suddenly, rather like the scene in Alice in Wonderland when she finds the cake saying, "Eat me," Sarah found herself shrinking fast, till she was the same size as her small interlocutors. They held out their hands to her, and she slipped down the side of the sofa with them. She was whole at last. What she was and what she might have been became sisters under the skin. She was in that dark world without either desire or regret. And it felt good. Sarah was beachcombing. It was just past low tide, and she could see for miles. The level sands in the distance mingled with the sea and the sky. She found some shells, a skein of seaweed, a child's plastic bracelet, a salty lump of wood. These were all close by, but in the distance, all of a sudden, she saw something huge on the sand. It must be a beached whale and was about 30 foot long. How sad. She set off at a trot to investigate. When she got there, she sank to her knees with shock. It was no whale at all, but a gigantic penis. She walked round it. The parts were all there, the frenum, the foreskin, the veins. No testicles. They must have been torn away in a storm, perhaps. Anyway, what was she to do? If it had been a whale, she might have alerted the authorities, tried to keep it alive with wet towels and wait for the turn of the tide. But wet towels didn't seem the right solution in this case. Without its owner, the penis could not survive, surely. And if it could, that was too frightful to contemplate. She walked round it again. It was indeed sad. Sarah had expected to be afraid of it, but curiosity was what she felt. She sensed a shift in the wind. It was now an onshore breeze, and the tide had been coming in for a little while. The penis lay on a sandbank. There was a rolling and a commotion in the water. The sea was bearing the thing away, but it might bear Sarah with it. It was a riptide. She ran with all her might towards the sandhills. Turning round, she saw the huge object start to float, making a roaring sound as it was dislodged from its bed. The churning water made it roll over, so that the little hole on the underside was now on the top, and the pressure of the water forced a spurt of water out. It looked like a whale's blowhole, and indeed made a hollow, mournful sound as it was borne out to sea. Sarah watched until she could see it no more, but it sang for a long while until nightfall. It might have been wrecked on another beach, but she never heard news of it. Nonetheless, she decided that her beachcombing days were over. The next rip current might be really dangerous. I could hear a tap dripping, but I knew there was no sink in my room. Nonetheless, I made a fingertip search round the skirting board and the door jambs. I was worried that the cistern was leaking and that the runaway water was seeping down the walls, melting the paper and the mortar, ruining the fabric of the house. I cocked my head on one side like a dog to hear the sound better. It wasn't a regular drip, but a sort of dot and carry one drip. Plash, plash, bang, plash, plash, bang. And then, every 5 cycles, there was a rippling sound, a trickle which lasted for 3 seconds exactly. This was very strange. I had to examine the room more carefully. On the far wall, the striped wallpaper had a slightly different texture, lumpier almost. I knocked on it. There was a hollow sound. But the hollowness had an oblong shape. Someone had wallpapered over a door. With a little knife, I traced the door's shape and cut round it. I ripped the paper off. It was indeed a door, but it was like no door I had ever seen. Bland, glinting, mysterious. I fetched a crowbar and levered it off. It was a cupboard, and inside it was the strangest machine I had ever seen. Little cups emptied into larger ones at regular intervals, set in motion by the cascades, and it was clear that there was a complex gearing system to take account of the times when the water ran too fast or too slow. It was a water clock. I drew closer to it and saw inscribed on the plinth, "My name is Clepsydra. Fear me, I know all, I bury all." Suddenly I realised that this timepiece was so inexorable that out of the simplest materials someone had constructed a death clock. The minutes were marked off, the hours, days, weeks, months, years. The water marked the seasons and also periods in human life. The time when one could have a child, the time when one became old, the time when one should die. Each period was marked by a tiny sound. One sounded like a laugh, one sounded like a cry, one sounded like the thump of something falling. It was impossible to live with the water clock. I fetched some hardboard, and in my cack-handed fashion I covered the door up again. I put in extra baffles and some felt. Finally I papered it over again, but this time using paper with little bundles of flowers, rosy and vibrant. The dripping was still audible, but only just, and if you moved about a lot and sang sometimes, you really couldn't hear it at all. Once I believed in miracles. I loved the idea that people might fly, that a dog might talk, that one morning everything might seem new, and that people might choose to be how I wished them to be. It was fun to suppose that one might get one's heart's desire simply by dint of wanting it enough. I discovered that there was a substance called miracle jam, which I alone could make. It was compounded of Mirabelle plums, small, lustrous fruit, pulsing with light, looking as if they had been bought at Goblin Market. They were mixed with sugar and spice, boiled and bottled. Glabrous the Mirabelles might be, transformative they certainly were. Once I could persuade people to eat the jam, all would be well, and for a while it was. But then my miracle jam started to fail. The effects were catastrophic. My dog, who had just begun to learn his alphabet and tonic solfa, relapsed into growls and whines. My nightly perambulations through the ether, I could swoop and glide through the air as soon as it became dark, now ceased with a bump, and I became bruised and earthbound. And my lover, who had been attentive and amusing, started to instruct me in a ponderous manner about how to write and to cook. A sprinkling of coarse hairs suddenly erupted and paraded down his nose like a sprig of holly on top of a plum pudding. My heart was in my boots. Was this how it was going to be for evermore? Was this what growing old meant? Something had to be done. Perhaps there could be an unearthly addition to the jam. I spoke aloud as I was walking in a wood. I'd give quite a lot, I said, to make the miracle jam work again. There was a rustle in the tree above me, and a figure tumbled out onto the path. It was a little man. Parts of him were green, parts of him were black, parts were purple. He had a sardonic expression. "Let us trade," said he. "Let us trade. What will you give for the miracle jam?" "Anything," I said, "anything. Eternal life, salvation, all that." "Very well," said he. "Now look carefully." He took some sour-looking herbs from his pocket and a substance that looked like honey. He pounded them together into a pot. "Now cut your finger and let the blood run into the pot." I did so. To the mix he added fruits I had never seen before, some spittle, and finally his own blood, which was green. "Now," said he, "recite, 'The miracle is worth the sacrifice.'" I did so. He told me that a drop of the pot's contents would make 50 jars, and then he was gone. I had seen his footsteps in the dust of the path as he walked along just ahead of me. Now they had disappeared halfway up the track. And the miracle jam did work. I made serried ranks of it, and it flashed and hummed on the shelves. The dog became an opera singer. The lover was able to combine vigour with finesse. I could fly without dizziness or fear. Everyone who received a pot found that their hair began to shine and that every day fulfilled its early promise. I knew, of course, that I had traded in a long future for the present moment, but I did not care, since the present moment was now like a bright illuminated frame which passed slowly through a world of greyness. This was the miracle, and with its sweetness on my tongue, it was hard to fuss about what might happen next. When viewed from above, the tricorn was meant to look like a three-cornered hat, and that was why it was named the tricorn. That was odd. Who, after all, will be able to view it from that height? It was very tall, and tricorn hats were habitually worn in the 18th century and signified power and élan, neither of which were appropriate for the denizens of Portsmouth from that part of town, either in the present or the past. Well, there it was. The project was designed to fit into a triangular space, and it was intended to house a shopping centre, a car park, and some nightclubs. But it never succeeded. And the official explanations for its failure were predictable. The corrosive sea air which damaged the concrete, the entrepreneurs who were too timid to take risks, the intractable one-way traffic system. But the unofficial explanations were more convincing. The local myth was that the tricorn was haunted, and in a very sinister way. The original architects had called it the souk, because they envisaged it functioning rather like an oriental market, lively, colourful, informal, but they had failed to take the location into account. It was built on top of a bomb site, a place where hundreds of civilians had died in raids in World War II. In addition, it was hard by an ancient market called Charlotte Street, where the poor habitually shopped. And it was also close to Portsea, with its alleyways and morally dubious reputation. The tricorn was thus the central hub of a whole set of histories, or, to put it another way, it was the icing on top of a very indigestible cake. Soon after it was completed, people began reporting strange events there. Well, not officially reported, as they never reached the newspapers, but the culture of gossip in the town was powerful. And from the networks of family and social relationships, stories gradually emerged. Souk merchants were seen trying to set up street stalls, lentils, spices, perfumes. The merchants themselves were a little shadowy in that you couldn't see them properly in sunlight. They were unable to settle into their sales pitch because another group kept attacking them. The second group wore cutlasses, eye patches, striped pantaloons and tricorn hats, and they uttered dreadful imprecations as they hacked the merchants to pieces. In other spaces in the complex, bomb victims seemed to emerge from the ground, some carrying a canary in a cage, some seeking a lost limb or relative, and all keening in a piteous way. One or two listeners thought that the cries were merely the wind whistling through the concrete alleyways. The prevailing wind was, after all, a southwesterly, but it was too piercing for that. And then the women. A gaggle of hungry, bedraggled females would often appear. Some were gaudily selling themselves at cheap prices. Others were pallid mothers with motionless babies sifting through the litter. Pretty soon, people started to avoid the place. There had been several suicides from the top of the car park. It was, after all, the highest spot in the city. But some people said that these desperate creatures had been driven mad by the sights and sounds of the tricorn. It evoked uncomfortable emotions, terror, nostalgia, pity, regret. You risked being buffeted by the people of the past who had been unwillingly catapulted into rebirth by concrete and bulldozers. And these people would frighten you because they had been frightened themselves. In the end, after much wrangling, it was decided to demolish the tricorn. A large crowd assembled to watch. Parts of the building had been taken down earlier, but a recognisable portion remained. It was dynamited, and there was a hollow boom and a huge cloud of dust. But that was not all. From the wreckage came screams, choking coughs, and wailing, as well as utterances that few people could understand. A flurry of objects flew through the air. Ragged pelisse, thigh boots, empty feeding bottles, full-bottomed wigs, ARP booklets, bloody bandages. It was a snowstorm from the past. The crowd panicked, of course, as the air became full of poor souls in flight. Where did they go to? To some new building site, perhaps, or to some forgotten cellar. It was not an exorcism, but a displacement. The crowd knew that, and for some time they were afraid to walk the streets or to open their doors for fear that they should meet anyone transparent who was homeless or hungry or wearing a three-cornered hat. Christopher was a baritone, and he was beginning to make a name for himself. His voice had a rotund quality. It was strong without being coarse, subtle without being querulous. He hoped in time that he might succeed in the great operatic roles, but for the moment he concentrated on oratorios because they paid well. The baritone voice was, he thought, both virile and sensitive when handled properly. But what he really loved was Lieder, and he worked hard at his German until he was competent enough. He tried all the great cycles, Winterreise and so on, but he preferred those song cycles which were about romantic yearning and which celebrated and grieved for the feminine. Soon he became jealous of those song cycles written for women, for the female voice, Frauenliebe und Leben, and so on. Why should women be the only ones to sing this sublime music? And so he had all the songs transposed for the baritone voice. To be sure, they sounded a little odd here and there, but no matter. If his voice attested to a sense of strain, it was all the more dramatic. Sometimes he couldn't find the key, but that could be exciting. Audiences might have to work a little harder. Often they would crowd into the auditorium, chattering loudly, and the shock of his voice, a male performing a female song, would silence them. He began to wonder whether he couldn't attempt the great operatic contralto roles, but the critics would be gunning for him, and he needed to prepare himself by assiduous rehearsals. But then something terrible happened. Terrible. His voice went on strike. It was broken, totally and completely broken. His voice had always been a chest voice, rumbling up from the depths of his body, but now nothing would come. That glorious power and embonpoint had gone. Standing in front of the mirror, Christopher tried to make new sounds. Suddenly, it was as if his body was in a lift and had soared from the basement to the penthouse. A new voice came roaring out of his mouth, but it was a head voice, high, piercing, female and strong at the same time. Without wishing to, he had become a countertenor. This was alarming, as there was, to him at least, always the aroma of femininity about countertenors, or worse. He recalled that the countertenor phenomenon had originated with the castrati, boys emasculated in order to maintain their vocal purity and range. Did his new voice mean that his masculinity was somehow impugned? Was there a secret message being transmitted from his body? Christopher's first response was to grow a large, unambiguous beard. He would have to change his apparel, and he decided that to appear more manly, he would wear cowboy clothes, jeans, plaid shirts, leather chaps, Stetsons, high boots, and spurs. His musical technique was unchanged, though. He applied himself diligently to the countertenor repertoire and realised that it was demanding and varied. Moreover, there was a gap in the market. Most of the major countertenors were dead or retired, or else they were too expensive for the smaller venues to hire. Accordingly, his bookings flowed in thick and fast. There was always a gasp of astonishment when he strode onto the stage. The cowboy outfits led audiences to expect a number from Seven Brides and Seven Brothers or Oklahoma. But instead, this soaring, sweet, semi-feminine sound issued forth. It knew Italian. It was full of decorum. It had an undertow of rebellion. Christopher never knew why it had all happened. It might have been his hubris in stealing and adapting the female songs. Either his body or the music had taken its revenge. But his ambiguity, on stage at least, brought the profits rolling in. He just hoped that his voice box didn't decide to change into a bass. That repertoire was much more limited. Child's Play. This is based on a painting of somebody called Josiah Child, done by John Riley, and it's in the Portsmouth Museum and various other places. There are copies of it too. Child's Play. Well, here I am. I am Josiah Child. Once I was as alive as you. But the difference between us is this, that I will always be here because I am made of canvas and oil paint. You will be gone in, 10, 20 years? I was important enough to immortalise. You are not. And so that gives me an advantage. I admit that the painter John Riley, whose work I will permit you to admire, had some skill. He was good at texture. the lace jabot, the silken sleeves, the cascading curls of my wig. He cost me a great deal of money to employ, and I had to urge him to conceal as much as he revealed. The furniture had to display very little, so that my flesh could display more by contrast. These pale hands have never done a day's physical labour, and my fingers are tapered like a lady's. Of course, there is blood on them, but it cannot be seen by the naked eye. My face, too, conceals more than it reveals. My lips are soft, my cheeks are round, but I am no woman. I am ruthless in commerce. Mercantilism gives me more pleasure than love. Everything can and should be bought and sold. The trick is to cast an air of decency over its stratagems. It suits me to appear malleable, but behind my back they call me the despot of Leadenhall Street. I headed up the East India Company. The best days were when the boats drew into port. I would walk down the cobbled streets and be assailed by the perfumes which rose up from the hold. Sweet, sour, pungent, melancholy. I love the scent of cinnamon in the mornings. It smells of victory. To be sure, slavery, beatings and exploitation did take place, but the spices hung over such ugly but necessary scenes and beautified them in a way. The red gold cloud made us see the horrors less acutely, and after all, a little nutmeg, a few cloves, will sweeten the sourness of our desires to own things, to crush things, to devour things. And there is the rub. Plants and people have an inconvenient habit of dying if they come from the wrong clime. The fair sex now, they are other than us and inhabit a different air. One wrong word, one misplaced gesture, and they will sicken and die. I have been very unfortunate in my wives. Hannah, Mary, and Emma served under me, gave me children, but each in turn wilted and died. They did not understand that there should be a free trade of the female body, and that there are certain pleasures to be derived from being in thrall. They were my empire too. I sit alone now and look out at you. I would like a new wife. Listen, fecund, moist, submissive. You could be my newfound land. Reach out your hand to me. Step into this frame. You might live forever. That year, Sarah decided to avoid the expense of a shop-bought Christmas tree. She would source one from nature. Accordingly, she trudged on her own into the forest, dragging her toboggan behind her, and she received some strange looks, as there was no snow. At last, deep in the woods, there it was, the ideal tree. 3 feet high, sturdy, with a strong trunk and plentiful needles. Perfect. She dug it out. The taproot was long and powerful, and she had to take her little axe to it. She fancied that she heard something like a groan as she chopped the root and pulled the tree from the earth. "Don't be silly. Trees can't groan," she said to herself. She put it into a pot in the corner of the living room and settled it in with soil and fertilizer. But the food must have been too rich, as the tree started to grow very fast. at least 6 inches a day. It seemed to have a will of its own. One morning she came downstairs and found that the tree had somehow moved nearer to the window. It also had strong opinions about the ornaments it would allow to be placed on its boughs. Sarah liked her baubles to be bright and traditional. Santa and his sleigh, holly sprigs, poodles holding parcels, all that. But every morning she came down to find her ornaments unaccountably smashed on the carpet. The tree seemed to have austere tastes, and it began to put forth ornaments of its own, glistening red yewberries. This was odd, since it was not a yew, and brown acorns. It was not an oak tree either. And the scent! It exuded a smell she had never experienced before. It was rich and musky, with a slight undertow of rot. It was like a glorious but malevolent fungus. Everyone who came to the house commented on the smell as soon as they came in the door. They never visited a second time. Worse was to come, though. When Sarah reached behind the tree to adjust a picture on the wall, she could have sworn that it tried to embrace her. Certainly she felt enclosed, and the pine needles pricked her skin. She had to struggle quite hard to get out. Was it possible to be raped by a tree? When she stepped back, she saw that the tree had grown apace. It was pushing through the ceiling, and in the next few days the joists of the house were compromised. This was going to be a terrible Christmas. Clearly, something had to be done. Sarah got her little axe out again and found a saw. She proceeded to destroy the tree, cutting off boughs and sawing into the main stem. Her activities were met with the most terrible screams. The tree was protesting its own execution. Sarah managed to drag the segments into the garden. She set fire to them on Christmas Eve. The twigs crackled as they took the kindling. The flames gave a roar, and then the whole tree was alight, but it seemed to have a will of its own in death, as it had had in life. The flames leapt across to Sarah's garden shed and engulfed it instantly. Worse, the intense heat made the conservatory windows shatter into 1,000 pieces, so that the air was filled with shards of glass, as well as pine needles, resin and ash. The fire engine siren didn't sound much like jingle bells. Ruefully, Sarah wondered what had gone wrong. Had it been vandalism to uproot the tree? Had she effectively stolen it from its woodland home? Should she have used fertiliser on it? Should she have worshipped it as a pagan deity rather than using it as a festive backdrop? One thing was certain, though. The tree had a spirit of its own, and it had taken its revenge. When she came through the door, she heard the answer phone bleeping, telling her that she had 3 messages. The first was, "Come to Glencoe as fast as you can." The second was, "Wear something dark." And the third was, "Be prepared to have your life transformed." These were irresistible messages, of course. She set out at once in her car, knowing that Glencoe was many hundreds of miles away. It had been the site of a famous massacre, and she imagined the place to be threatening and wearisome. The journey took 2 days, and as she approached the glen, she realised that thousands and thousands of other people had been summoned too. She could go no further by car, and so she changed into dark clothes, picked up her overnight bag and left her vehicle by the side of the road. Then she walked in. It was a long way, and she saw from afar that the floor of the glen itself was crammed with people, so many that the foothills were crowded with them too. Her bag was too heavy, so she left it hidden under a bush. When she arrived, she was still on the edge of the crowd. As instructed, they were all in dark colours: black, navy, olive, charcoal, burnt umber. There were even some animals: panthers, black cats, brown dogs, all standing quietly. It was nearly dusk. Everyone was looking to the west. The colours were glistening in the dying light, and the vast crowd looked like an iridescent carapace. She realised that all the people, men, women, children, young and old, all races, were breathing with the same rhythm. Their coordinated breaths flowed in and out slowly. It was as though the whole crowd was one set of lungs. She caught up with their rhythm, and then they started to sing. But she had never heard a song like this: wild, high, keening, and full of the most unslakable longing. If there were words, she could not hear them, but that did not seem to matter much. The melody, held on the quiet breath of thousands of people, spoke of desire, but for what? Then, right on the edge of the crowd, on the far eastern side, she saw it. It was like a sparkle at first, which progressed to a glimmer. There were no fireflies or glowworms this far north, she knew, so it must be something else. Gradually, slowly, the glow progressed and moved into the crowd. No one was hurt, no one cried, but she saw that they were changing. The people were becoming golden. Their skin and clothes were like the sun. She saw them turn to each other and laughed. "I see you." The animals were joyful too. The floor and the sides of the glen were golden, as if the place were an enormous cauldron, but without scalding or pain. This was what a blessing was. She knew that none of them would ever be the same again. Gradually, Glencoe would be emptied of its people, but the light would sear and anneal all those who had seen it. The yellow colour might fade from their skin and clothes, perhaps, but their breath, their song, their glance would remain golden forever. My name is Martha Hudson, and Mr. Holmes, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson are my lodgers, my clients, my burden. Mr. Holmes in particular was my burden. He was often peremptory, imperious, short-tempered. He had a great belief in detail, in observing the slimy traces left by the snail as it edged its way along some domestic precipice, or noting the way one hand would always be grubbier than its partner. I used to say to myself that it was a pity his zeal for detail did not extend to the bursten buttonholes of his dress shirt. The grounds in his coffee cup could speak volumes, but he thought he was the only one who could read signs. He was not, however. I was well paid, of course, rather over the odds, if the truth be told, but I felt I needed a little extra to compensate for the way they ignored my status, for I was a gentlewoman. The respectable widow of Dr. Horatio Hudson, late of Morningside in Edinburgh. After my husband's early death, I gave up the house there and took a lease in Baker Street in London. To be sure, the household servants I employed were rough and occasionally disobliging, but I could manage them. As soon as I came to terms with Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, I realised that I could only accommodate them, as there was so much to take care of and to watch. They had such interesting callers, and Mr. Holmes' fame was growing. I gradually came to realise that he was not a well man. Not at all. He had distinct oddities of behaviour which he tried to pass off as idiosyncrasies. The tight buttoning of the cap ribbon under the chin, the requisite number of pleats in the cape, the exact type of meerschaum. If the smallest detail were wrong, he was vexed beyond reason. And the music. Often he seemed to be in pain everywhere, and only that wretched violin would assuage it. He used to say, "Mrs. Hudson, each of these arpeggios is better than a draught of tonic." Something seemed to be awry with his hearing, as he played sharp all the time. He had black moods which came from nowhere, like thunder from a clear sky, and then he would get out that syringe and that long needle and plunge it into his arm again and again. Besides blood from the needle, there was often pus on his underwear. It took some scrubbing. Dr. Watson was in awe of him and was blinded by his acuity, but I was not, and I had listened to everything my husband had said about illness, its causes and its courses. I put all the symptoms together and placed them, as it were, on my husband's death, and it went through me with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Holmes was mortally ill. He must have syphilis, a disease which takes many years to unfold and takes many forms. He seemed to be in the second stage. Suddenly everything fell into place. His moods, his boils, his attitude to the fair sex. He hated us all, except perhaps for Irene Adler. Perhaps she had loved him to death. Certainly he could never bear to touch any of us. My husband had sworn by Mercury, not as a cure for syphilis, but as an ameliorating treatment. Accordingly, I procured some, made it into a salve, and bided my time. Mr. Holmes came to me with a suppurating rash on his hands. I gave him the salve, making sure not to touch the oozing flesh. Within a week, the rash was clear. I thought to myself, Mr. Holmes is not the only one who can solve a mystery. And every time I effect a minor cure in the long march of this illness, I'll give my little triumph a name. This one will be called the Speckled Hand. Vera and Bob got engaged during the war. She'd always wanted to have a white silk wedding dress, but in those times of scarcity there was none to be had. Many girls got married in their smartest suit, with a corsage and a silver horseshoe. It looked appropriate with a husband in uniform, but that was not Vera's heart's desire. Then all of a sudden, a friend at one of the Air Force provisioning centres purloined a length of parachute silk and brought it home under her frock. It was still warm. Vera ran it through her fingers. It was pearly, soft and gossamer. Perfect. Her mother made the dress. The material itself seemed a little recalcitrant, hard to fashion, although it seemed to have a will of its own. She had wanted something sleek and fitted, but somehow the billowing folds asserted themselves and the whole ensemble took a shape of its own volition. There were tucks and frills and peplums, so that Vera, who was a tiny thing, looked almost lost in it, like an insect in the centre of an enormous cabbage rose. The wedding day dawned, and Vera and Bob went to church. The ceremony was quick but heartfelt. During the service, the dress seemed to rustle unconscionably. They walked back down the aisle, and Vera thought to herself that she would never be so happy again. This turned out to be the case. When they came out of the church, an enormous wind had got up, and they all struggled to remain upright. The wind seemed to be making a beeline for Vera, and it buffeted the enormous frock. All of a sudden, she felt very light on her feet. But she was not dancing. She was flying. The wind took the silk and whirled Vera up into the clouds. She was never seen again. Bob survived the war, even though Vera did not. He liked afterwards to tell the tale of the sky-born bride and the vengeful parachute, but few people ever believed him. My grandmother Florence told me that you could always recognise people by their cough. There's no mistaking that, she would say. It's the one thing you can't disguise. I asked her how she knew with such certainty, so one day, as a bedtime story, she told me. It was during the blackout. There was no street lighting, and all the windows had black blinds or curtains. People walking about had dimmed torches. The streets were thronged that night. A delicious, dangerous anonymity was in the air. You might be anyone. You might love anyone. After all, if you might be blown to bits, what was the harm in a little dalliance with a stranger? But she was looking for her husband. It was a bad marriage, but it was all she had ever known. She paced the roads looking for him. He was late. Then suddenly she heard a cough. It was him. His name was Francis, but he was always called Chum. Chum, she called sharply. Chum, is that you? He loomed out of the blackness, and she saw dimly that he had a woman in tow, younger and prettier than she. He said, "Look, you might as well know. This is Vera, and we're going to get married after the war is over." All she could think of to say was, "I knew you by your cough." After the war came the court, the divorce, the bitterness, which lasted a lifetime. Florence began to compile a taxonomy of coughs. The nervous one, which presaged a demand for money owed. The rasping one, which belonged to the angry butcher. The hollow one, which recalled a long stay in the sanatorium. She could foretell the arrival of the rentman and the tallyman by their coughs as they walked up the entry. As she became older, Florence began to hear a new cough, and it belonged to no one she knew. It was a fruity, loose affair, and sounded as though it were streaked with blood. It was not a polite or an apologetic cough. She said she could hear it in the eye of her mind. "I know who it is," she said one day. "It is Mr. Death." He did come for her, as he comes for us all. And now, every time I hear a cough, I think it might be him. If the cough is raw or bloody, I am afraid. If it is mixed with laughter, or if it is a little staccato, then I know it is nothing. Nothing for the moment. I was besotted with this particular spaniel I had, Geoffrey. Obliging, obedient, devoted, I felt he knew me through and through. He seemed to intuit which direction I would walk, which people I liked best. His fallback position one of doleful tolerance. I loved Geoffrey with all my heart, or as much of it as I could spare. Sometimes I wished he could speak, and I would imagine the high-flown conversations we'd have. We'd pat the ball of dialectics to and fro between us, arguing through points about politics, art, food. We'd only disagree enough for it to be stimulating. I fantasised that Geoffrey would have the sort of mellifluous voice that always turned me on, a sort of canine Alan Rickman, perhaps. Just occasionally, the thought is father to the deed. One day, I was trying on a new outfit, scrutinising myself in the mirror, and I heard this voice. "What do you think you look like in that frock?" It was a strong Birmingham accent, one which I have always rather disliked. I looked round. No one was in the room. Perhaps it was the radio. But no, the voice came from Geoffrey's direction, and it intoned something else. "That is an unbecoming shade for someone of your colouring." I bent down to Geoffrey and opened his mouth. Teeth, tongue, lips. There was no speaking mechanism. How could I have been so silly? But then the voice came again. It was clear through some magical means that Geoffrey had been able to communicate with me through the ear of my mind, as it were. I squealed, "Geoffrey, is that really you?" The voice replied, "Yes, and I've been waiting long enough for you to hear." At first, I was overjoyed at all my favourite's utterances. He did indeed love me, and told me so all the time. Not in a flowery way, but in a rather forthright way, and with his unambiguous accent. Of course, I had bought him from a lady spaniel breeder in Great Barr in Birmingham. Why would he not speak like that? The trouble was that Geoffrey had very firm views. First of all, on my appearance. He was very good at noticing little flaws. "There's a mark on your skirt. That hem is uneven. I can't understand why you don't change your shampoo." Secondly, the company I kept. He didn't like my friends. "Can't she talk quieter? Why do you let that man hold your hand? They never leave any food on their plates." I did feel loved, but I also felt judged. Really, Geoffrey only wanted walks, dinner, and me. I had hoped for sparkling conversation, but most typically he would look round the quiet evening room and say, "This is nice." Then he'd say it again, and often a third time. I had to agree to keep the peace, but it is in my nature to be devious, and eventually I took to keeping secrets. He always knew, of course, and said reproachfully and sententiously, "Tell the truth and shame the devil." He was fond of little proverbs like that, never missing an opportunity to take the moral high ground, and as I was something of a bohemian and a vagabond, that could be irksome. In the end, Geoffrey died in his sleep, and I mourned him bitterly. But I never got another dog. Geoffrey taught me the folly of never expecting from people what they could not give. And I also learnt from him that love can be possessive and judgmental. I got a cat after that, and her scorn and indifference were easier to live with, though she never spoke a word. Pauline knew for sure that her husband Trevor was having an affair. For one thing, he started to have a shower more than once a week. And for another, he looked in the mirror a lot, practicing his most winsome expressions. That did make him look crazed. Pauline observed him closely. He kept his phone hidden and changed his underwear more often than usual. When she monitored his website visits, she saw that he had consulted once about Viagra and cheap teeth transplants. Something was clearly afoot. She listened to his muffled conversations, and then afterwards, carefully and deliberately, she shut the door with a gentle thud to throw him off the scent. It must be that fat Trixie from the office. She knew how to flatter Trevor by praising his agendas and minutes and by looking at him under her eyelashes. Pauline would have to take steps. Her uncle had been a butcher, and she knew how to hang a carcass and how to carve a sirloin. It was easy. Pauline felled Trixie with a croquet mallet and set about converting her into choice cuts. She would make her into a pie. Trevor's favourite pie was steak and kidney. The steak was no problem, though the kidneys were harder to get at. In the end, though, she managed to get a nice plateful and made a succulent gravy from Trixie's bones. The pie crust was more tricky. Pauline was a rotten pastry hand, but in the end the pie was ready. It was a triumph. The crust was glistening, and she had taken care to hold it up by inserting a little pottery blackbird in the centre of the pie, its beak just poked through, like in the nursery rhyme. Trevor enjoyed his meal. Afterwards, when Pauline told him what or who he had just eaten, he was put out, to say the least. Like it? I certainly do not. Now I know what it was. I can't begin to understand what you were thinking of. Well, it's up to you to dispose of the evidence. It's nothing to do with me. Actually, it wasn't that difficult. There was a company picnic the next week, and Pauline volunteered to do all the catering. Brawn and pressed tongue, cold rissoles, coronation chicken. All Trevor's colleagues praised his wife's culinary skills. She noticed, though, that Trevor only ate a bought Scotch egg. No one seemed to miss Trixie. Rumour had it that she was taking care of a sick aunt, but as Pauline remarked, she was at the party in spirit. Augustina had always had problems seeing things from the front. Everyone else seemed to find it easy to read people's faces. Their lips, their eyebrows carried signs that could easily be decoded, but not by her. Women's breasts could carry messages about their age, their lactation, their general perkiness. And men's penises, of course, could easily be read as indices of their mood, their desires, their religion. But again, not by her. She always got it wrong. The results of her misreadings could be comical and sometimes dangerous. But the back now. This was something different. You could always be safe with a back. The vertebrae spoke volumes to Augustina, and she always knew by looking at the set of the shoulder girdle and its alignment with the hips whether the owner of the spinal column was having a good day or not. For Augustina, the gluteal muscles were more eloquent than eyebrows any day of the week. Skilled interpreters of the human face knew how to read the eyebrow flash, but Augustina knew how to derive meaning from a shrug. There must be a way to make a living out of her skill. At first, she considered being an osteopath, but people liked to have an initial consultation face to face, and for Augustina that would never do. She wanted to talk to the back. She was quite good at drawing, though. Perhaps that might be a way forward. Accordingly, she began to draw people's backs, and she was very adept. She knew none better how to capture the sadness in a pair of buttocks or the disappointments of the sacroiliac. And once her name got about, clients came to her in droves. They sat on chairs, they reclined on couches, they looked backwards over their shoulders. That was just about okay. And Augustina soon became known as the Queen of the Spinal Column. Much could be adduced from the back and much could be hidden by it, and her works of art began to function as riddles and talking points in polite society. There were some further possibilities, of course. One of her customers offered to trial a fashion house for her, and accordingly a range of clothes was designed that did rather well in warmer climes. Backless outfits for both sexes, with large rear pockets that could carry kittens or small laptops. A spin-off of tattoos was mooted, with explanatory arrows inscribed onto the flesh of the back. Augustina was now very well known. She appeared on television, but not filmed from the front. Oh no. She devised a very ornate hairstyle of tiny plaits and curls and developed a sort of limited ventriloquist skill, such that it appeared that the answers she gave issued from the back of her head. She proposed that the Mona Lisa and the Laughing Cavalier would be much more interesting if they were painted from the back, as indeed they turned out to be. The Connoisseur. This is me reading it. It is to a film made by Alan Everett, artist and filmmaker, who's interpreted the story in his own way. And I hope you'll enjoy it. And that's the last story in this sequence. Thank you.
You don't think I'm sitting too close to the screen? Sure, it might be interesting. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, it's been such a long time since I went out. Me too. I've been looking forward. It's about to start.
Henry had worked for many years for a major auction house. He worked as a buyer and often negotiated for whole collections. Occasionally he was the auctioneer, although he found this painful, too close to the public. His job gave him access to unusual objects, and he amassed several small collections. He liked things which were not necessarily valuable in themselves, but which could be displayed together in groups, like with like, in order to show their qualities and the subtlety of their owner. Henry was a completist of sorts. 1930s jugs with bird motifs, large plaster maidens being pulled along by dogs, green plates with oranges superimposed round the rim, clockwork toys, little dancing ladies with long frocks. One collection was special though. These were his bathing beauties, little figurines about 3 inches high, made in the 1920s and 30s. All the little ladies wore bathing suits, and they disported themselves with great confidence and style. One balanced upon a rock, one astride a dolphin, one nestled inside a giant flower, one inside a conch shell. One dived into the water, another pirouetted on a ball. They were made in a period when, for the first time, women began to feel at ease with their bodies, and could use or display them for their own pleasure. They all smiled, but for themselves. They were athletes of the heart. Henry arranged the bathing beauties on a table close by his bed. He loved to touch them, to stroke them, to rearrange them in new groups. Just occasionally, in fanciful moments, he thought he saw a flash of rage on their faces, as if they felt they were being interfered with. Of course, this was nonsense, mere conjecture on his part, but it would do them no harm to be reminded of who owned them, and so he made a point of moving them around every night. Diffident and fastidious, he found them troubling. Henry was no longer young, and he started to experience some terrible symptoms which he attributed to old age. The most bothersome were pins and needles in his fingers. Sometimes little dabs, sometimes sharp stabs. They came on every night and lasted all day. Ah, thought Henry, I have trapped something in my neck. And he duly visited an osteopath and a chiropractor, but to no avail. All the crackings and manipulations in the world would not do the trick. Finally, in desperation, Henry consulted a specialist who thought he might have multiple sclerosis and who put him through many rigorous tests, but to no avail. It was not that which ailed him. Finally, he began to have the most disturbing dreams. Every night the bathing beauties came alive, and in his dream it seemed as though they clambered onto his bed and danced upon his counterpane. They scrutinised him, as he was wont to do to them, and romped up and down on his sleeping body, which he was powerless to move. But worse was to come. From somewhere, perhaps from his bedside drawer, they had procured a needle case. Each of them drew out, as it seemed to Henry in his dream, a needle, and brandished it like a sword. They advanced towards his fingers, lying inert like sausages, and pricked them again and again, sometimes on the knuckle, sometimes on the soft fingertips. He awoke with a yell, and the little ladies seemed to have scattered, but the counterpane was spattered with blood. His fingers bore the marks of tiny stab wounds. Henry now began to feel really afraid, though he knew it was ridiculous. How can anyone fear something that was only 3 inches high, and female to boot? They were doubtless angered because he had touched them and looked at them, and the most sensible thing to do would be to smash them or sell them. But this he could not endure, so he locked them in a little glass cabinet. For some months all was well, and he could view them in their incarceration. They were not smiling quite so much now. The cleaning lady was careless, or perhaps she had been suborned by their winsomeness to set them free. One day she left the case unlocked, and when Henry returned home it was empty. He was frantic, of course, but hoped they had been stolen. Certainly they were nowhere to be found, and gradually he relaxed back into a somnolent grief. Where were they? His little vixens, his naughty playthings. They were waiting for him. One night his neighbours were awakened by terrible, searing screams, and when they broke into Henry's bedroom, they found that his eyes had been skewered by needles. There had been 10 bathing beauties, and there were 10 needles. Henry was blinded. He later insisted that they had come to wreak their revenge on him, and that they must be found and broken. But none could be seen, except the littlest one, and Henry instructed his helpers to grind her and her dolphin to powder.